I'd like to introduce James Barclay. I had the pleasure of meeting James a few months ago, I think, during a training session. And really cool guy. He approached me about doing this talk, and I think it's something you're really going to enjoy. So not going to talk anymore. Without further ado, James Barclay.
All right, so as Dusty said, my name is James Barclay. I'm an IT consultant based in Berkeley, California, with a company called the Lindy Group. We've been around for about 20 years or so, but I joined just recently, within the last year. So today I'm going to talk about my experience with hosting the JSS on Amazon EC2. So how many people in the audience are familiar with Amazon Web Services or are currently using it? Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the agenda for today. First thing that we'll talk about is just the 5 W's, who, what, where, when, why. Then we'll go into the initial goals for the deployment and what the current solution looks like. And I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about what we did to make it work. In our case, we were using a Linux instance, but a lot of the same principles apply if you were to spin up a Windows server instance on EC2. Then I'll go into production experiences, what it's like to host the JSS on EC2. And then we'll end with the challenges and limitations. So what is EC2? According to Amazon, they have it listed as a web service that provides resizable compute capacity in the cloud. Now, this may not apply in everyone's case here if you're looking to host the JSS on EC2, but we see a lot of startups and companies that are looking to grow and scale their service, taking advantage of the Amazon Web Services platform, the ability for these instances to resize and you create spot instances and whatnot is very useful for them. So having that flexibility is nice. So who should do this? What came to mind immediately were startups that are growing. They have an existing Mac fleet that they need to manage. Maybe they have a lot of their infrastructure currently on EC2, and it's really easy for them to spin something like this up. And then also just any organization that's already making use of EC2 or Amazon Web Services in general. So where is the cloud? It's geographically distributed. Amazon has data centers, both edge and regions, throughout the world, basically. And when should you do this? We see it when companies either are tired of having to host infrastructure on site, or if they're already comfortable using the Amazon Web Services platform. And most importantly, why? So again, if you're already making use of this platform, it can make a lot of sense to go this route. So here's just a map depicting the Amazon Web Services regions and edge locations throughout the world. These are constantly growing, as you might imagine. So as for our initial goals, we really wanted to start small. So we spun up a single m1.large Ubuntu instance, which if you're familiar with the instance types available on EC2, they have memory optimized, storage optimized, compute optimized, GPU optimized. But in this case, the M family of instances is known as the general purpose family. So it was well suited to our JSS deployment. So since it was in the cloud, we really took security quite seriously. We wanted to force authenticated downloads over HTTPS, use an alternate port for SSH, of course a public Tomcat certificate, and when we initially did the deployment, we wanted everything to only be accessible behind the firewall, so while connected to the VPN or in the office. And this one was really important to document everything. So being able to reproduce what you've created and what you've spent all this time configuring was really important, especially when you are working with Amazon EC2, because there's the real possibility of unintentionally terminating an instance. So any of you that are currently using it know that there's things like termination protection and so on and so forth, but if you have a single instance and you have you've spent time configuring this, it's a good idea to be able to redeploy it if need be. So in terms of our current solution for this particular deployment, and this will likely grow in the future, we're still running the JSS itself on a single m1.large instance. We have 2 distribution points. In this case, one is using EC2 instance storage, which is volatile, and then one is running on an on-site Mac Mini. So that's another thing I'm going to stress throughout this is that the instance storage that is available when you spin up an EC2 instance is volatile. If you were to terminate the instance, that data would be gone. Amazon does have a workaround for that, which we'll touch on shortly. And we're using a separate instance for the MySQL database. And the reason we did this is because having the need to redeploy the JSS if something were to happen to it, having the MySQL database stored elsewhere, or still on EC2 but in a separate instance, was important to us. And in that case, we set up nightly snapshots to Amazon S3, which is their simple storage service. So what did we do to make it work? If you're not using Amazon Web Services currently, it's really easy to sign up, and it's free. Another thing is for 1 year, Amazon offers what's called the free usage tier, which allows you to spin up a relatively low-powered instance and use that for testing, piloting, and things like that. That might be a good opportunity to spin up a JSS and see what it's like to run it on EC2. So next, you would provision a Linux or Windows Server EC2 instance. And keep in mind the JSS requirements. I spoke just a moment ago about the free usage tier. That technically does not meet the JSS requirements for version 8 or 9, but it will install. You can get it up and running. Obviously, wouldn't recommend using that for a production instance, but it's an option. So here, I'll just show you a little bit about the instance details. So basically, the m1.medium and m1.large are very similar, just about double the amount of memory available in the large instance. And here is a screenshot showing the instance, or the general purpose instances available on Amazon EC2. As I mentioned earlier, they do have different optimized instances available, but these will probably serve you well for the needs of the JSS. Some of the stuff to the right there, like AES-NI, like that's the new instruction set for advanced encryption standard. Probably not relevant in our case here, but at least they're providing that info. So one of the things you'll do when you provision one of these instances, Amazon will walk you through this, is creating a new public-private key pair. They will actually allow you to download the private key during the instance creation or spin-up process, and that's the only time you'll be able to download it. So make sure that you keep this in a safe place and don't share it with anyone. And then you'll configure a security group, and basically a security group is a set of firewall rules that apply to infrastructure that exists in Amazon's data centers. So of course, the standard ports you'll need available for the JSS to operate, 80, 443, 22 if you're using the standard SSH port, and so on and so forth. Notice I put 445, that's of course for SMB, which is what we'll be using for uploads to the distribution point that is hosted on Amazon EC2. The next thing you'd probably do is create and attach an EBS volume, which again is the non-volatile storage that's available to you on Amazon EC2. And then you can launch your instance. So once the instance is running, you'll be able to get the public IP from the Amazon Web Services Management Console and configure DNS. Amazon offers a service called Route 53 for that. And at this point, you can SSH into the instance. I have here to the right an SSH config file. How many people here are familiar with that or have used something like that in the past? Okay, so if you find yourself having to SSH into, a server, or it's also very handy for things like SCP. This basically allows you to create somewhat of an alias for each server where you specify your private key, the host name of the server, user to authenticate as, so on and so forth. So it ends up simplifying things quite a bit. So in this case, if I created a host called JSS, I could just type SSH JSS to access the instance. So once you're in, you'll want to configure the instance. One of the first things you should probably do is run the updates, install OpenJDK, MySQL Server, and then you'll access the MySQL command line. This probably is familiar to you. You create the Jamf software database, create a user called Jamf software that has permissions to administer that particular database. And then download the JSS installer for Linux or Windows. In this case, again, using SCP. If we have our SSH config file set up, it's just a matter of passing it the path to the local installer, and then the host, and then the remote path. And just unzip archive. And then you can run the JSS installer. At this point, you can connect to the JSS and can complete the initial JSS setup. So next, we'll talk about configuring Samba. So this is what we'll need to be able to upload packages, scripts, and the like using Casper admin. So to start with this process, we'll just create a Casper shared directory and then install Samba, and then add the user for Casper admin and also for Casper install. And then give them both a password. Next, you would probably want to make a backup of the existing smb.conf file, and then proceed with editing it. And here you'll see that we are giving it the path to the Casper share, also the read list, in this case, the Casper install user that we created, Casper admin, read or write, and then also valid users. And there are more options available there as well. And you don't have to use VI if you don't want. So then change the ownership of the Casper share directory, and then restart Samba. And at this point, if you're on your Mac, you can test connectivity via SMB, just using the Finder. And another thing is you'll probably want to specify the allowed inbound IPs in your security group so that you don't have an SMB share in the cloud that is accessible to everyone, which could be bad. So in this case, we wanted to use HTTPS for downloads. And to do that, of course, we'll install and configure Apache. And then edit the host configuration file for the Casper share. So obtaining a trusted SSL certificate. In our case, we were using a wildcard, which may or may not be a good thing, but talk about what we had to do here. Copy the certificate to /SSL private, enable the SSL module for Apache 2, and then you install the external authorization module, which in this case is going to allow us to use the Casper admin or Casper install to authenticate for the HTTPS downloads. And then we enable the external authorization module. So, and here is the host configuration file for the Casper share SSL. And if you can't see it, don't worry. I'm going to make these slides available on my GitHub, so anyone can download them and take a look. But basically, this is allowing you to configure the host for the SSL site, if you will, virtual host. And here I have the disabling the default site. So if you've ever just spun up a web server, you're probably familiar with like the welcome page for Apache. That's the default site. When you run this command, the A2 dis site, all that's doing is deleting a symbolic link in, I think it's etsy, whatever. So there are sites available and then sites enabled. So the idea is that sites available are sites that are configured but not necessarily deployed. Sites enabled are those sites that are actually running on the web server. So rather than having to create the symbolic link or delete it yourself, this command line utility just allows you to do that a little easier. So in this case, enabling site will create the symbolic link. Same thing for Casper share SSL. And then adding an alias directive to /Apache2 httpd.conf. And that's what that might look like. That way you don't have to type /mount Casper share in the browser. And then we'll just restart Apache. So once you've done all this, you can, at this point, test HTTPS downloads just by hitting the URL, try downloading one of the packages or scripts, make sure that's working. Another thing that I found useful, and at least with the version that we were deploying, which was like 8.6.4 at the time, I think, test downloads using curl, because that's how the Casper management framework was actually downloading these packages and scripts from the distribution points at that time. I don't know if that's still the case, but it was at the time, so probably doesn't hurt to test it. So that's what this command might look like. Use your super secret password. And here I'll talk a little bit about enabling SSL for Tomcat. Jamf has a really good write-up available on their website. But another thing to keep in mind is that this can and probably will vary depending on the distribution you choose or your certificate authority. So yeah, that's usually if you're using like, VeriSign or something, they'll give you, these are the exact commands you need to use to import or configure, Tomcat to use the certificate that you've purchased from them. In this case, it's exporting the password, or I'm sorry, exporting the certificate, and then we're importing the key store. And then we'll just move it to user local JSS Tomcat and then .keystore. And at this point, you can just restart Tomcat and then test. Make sure you get the little green box. So now you can configure your distribution points on the JSS. Here's what that might look like if you're using version 8. So enabling change management. We didn't have a syslog server available to us in this particular deployment, so we opted to keep the change management logs on the JSS. So basically, you just create a directory to store the JSS logs, change the ownership to Tomcat 7 for that particular directory, recursively, and then enable change management on the JSS. And here's what that might look like. Easy enough? So at this point, I'm going to talk a little bit about the production experiences and our lessons learned. As you might imagine, large downloads over the WAN connection could be painfully slow, especially when people are in an office. You'd expect, it seems like things shouldn't be taking so long, but of course they're not. The infrastructure is not there on site, so it's relying on the WAN connection. And to offset this, I talked earlier about having an on-site distribution point. If you're doing this for a company that really hates servers, doesn't want to have any of the infrastructure on site, they don't have to know that it's a server. It's a Mac Mini. You could just put it under someone's desk and not tell anyone. And then, of course, use some method of keeping the distribution points in sync. Also, uploading large packages using Casper Admin can take seemingly forever. You upload an OS image, it's got to go out over the WAN connection. To avoid that, again, set the local distribution point as the primary and then just let it sync so you don't have to think about it and you're not sitting there staring at a progress bar. Of course, network segments are your friend. If you, for instance, have the local distribution point as the primary, people are outside of the office, that's not accessible in every case. Make sure that you are making use of network segments within your JSS and within your policies. And this is something that really happened to us. So we were deploying the JSS with Puppet, and yeah, just make sure that your Puppet code does not ensure the absence of Apache. I was fighting with this for a while. It would work for a little while, come back the next day, HTTPS downloads aren't working. Couldn't really figure out why, because in every case I just like sudo apt-get Apache 2, and it would be working again. And part of the configuration file, some of the configuration files still existed, like a lot of the Apache configuration directories were there, but it was seemingly corrupt, or was corrupt. And yeah, after fighting with that, we figured out that Puppet was killing it. Bad Puppet. So what problems did we face in this deployment? Another one of the really frustrating ones was a really interesting problem, actually. I don't recall who I was working with from Jamf, but we were fighting with it for a while. I'll have it listed here as curl and libcurl madness. So basically what was happening is due to a mismatch in the version of libcurl that the Jamf management framework was making use of, linking that against OpenSSL 1.0 plus on the Ubuntu instance. So this is, I talked about earlier testing HTTPS downloads with curl. This should work, right? But it wasn't. But why? So it would work if I passed it -3. And what the -3 flag does for curl is it forces it to basically downgrade or to using SSL v3 when negotiating with the remote SSL server. But we shouldn't have to do that. It should be using TLS. So here's a mouthful, but after quite a bit of research, I found this article by Brian Fullerton, and he explained the problem. You'll see all of the dependencies here. So as I mentioned, libcurl linked against the mod SSL linked against OpenSSL 1.0 plus on the server, basically. So this wouldn't have been a problem, except that we were using a wildcard certificate, and basically the common name of the common name in the SSL certificate did not match the server name for Apache. And what happens is curl would interpret this as a fatal error, even though it's just a warning, and then basically terminate the connection. So one of the things that they also asked us to do was switch the ports for Apache and Tomcat. So I'll just say that this is a web services company. They're sensitive to URLs, I suppose. They didn't like seeing the 84:8443 port suffix in the URL. So this is mostly documented, especially changing the default port for Tomcat, or using the standard SSL port for Tomcat. Jamf has a good write-up on that, but of course, what are we going to use for Apache? So this is basically the same instructions that you'd get from Jamf. Change the Tomcat user variable in your startup script to root, and then change redirect port in the server XML file. And then you can just restart Tomcat, and that will do it for you if you don't want to see :8443 and you're not using Apache. If you're not relying on HTTPS for downloads, that will work. But we were. So this is what this server.xml file might look like when you're done. As for changing the port that Apache is using, we will edit the ports.conf file and then just change listen from 443 to 8443. And in the Kaspersher SSL host configuration file, change the virtual host directive to 8443. then restart Apache. And then at this point, you can log into your JSS, remove the port suffix from the JSS URL in the global management framework settings. And then as far as the distribution points, you specify port 8443 when configuring the distribution points on the JSS. And then you can test HTTPS downloads. Make sure to include the :8443 port suffix. And make sure that's all working. Yeah, so basically up there for port, you just change that. So limitations. So no Casper remote. Why? If you only have one JSS and it's running on EC2, the IP that the JSS is going to be getting from the clients is going to be the public IP. That's just because the clients are likely behind a NAT device. So you could probably work around that by using more than one JSS. We haven't tested that yet, but that might work out. Another thing, again, I want to stress that the instance storage available to you when you spin up an EC2 instance is volatile. It's basically, if you look at Amazon's documentation, it is actually basically a slice of the local disk. But when an instance is terminated, that goes away. So to work around that, just set up an EBS volume and use that for persistent storage. So at this point, I wanted to call out some of the resources that were extremely useful to me when doing the deployment. Of course, Amazon has great documentation. Brian Fullerton had the insight on the curl and libcurl mismatch that caused us so much trouble. Justin Rummel actually has a write-up on deploying the JSS on EC2. And I think he specifically talks about using the free usage tier instance to make that a reality. Of course, Jamf has really good documentation as well. And then the guys at 74-bit have a really good guide on setting up a distribution point on Linux. So with that, like I said, the slides are available on my GitHub. And I don't know why I put that picture there. It just seemed like a good idea. But yeah, does anyone have any questions in particular? Use the mic.
One issue I've run into in the past, this is not for Amazon EC2, but it is for Red Hat Enterprise Linux and Apache, is that mod NSS in Apache will try to run on port 8443, just like Tomcat does.
Right.
Did you run into any issues with that?
No, what was it? Mod what? What module?
Mod NSS.
Mod NSS.
It's like a directory service that Apache built in that I don't think anyone actually uses.
Okay. So that's the default for Red Hat Enterprise?
It's in there. I ran into it because I had to disable it when I first set up my JSS. And
Right.
Following on your Puppetize example,
Right.
We recently Puppetized my JSS,
Right.
and it accidentally stuck the mod NSS module back in. So all of a sudden, Apache stopped working.
Right, right. I'm not familiar with that particular module, but I would imagine that there's probably, like similar to what I was talking about with the ports.conf file for Apache, like usually you can just change whatever port it's listening on in a configuration file. There might be some other stuff you have to do, but Yeah, that can be a pain, definitely. Understand your pain there.
Yeah. Thank you.
Hi. Have you had any attempts of trying to get this to work with S3 storage? Because, I mean, you could use that as a repository, HTTP.
Right. We did not explore that option, but I did mention that we are using S3 just for the database backups. So so we have a nightly snapshot that just, and this is something, in this case, they use MySQL a lot internally. So like they have, you know, a MySQL Puppet node or whatever that they can just deploy, and we're just basically stuck the JSS database on there and just change the, you know, make sure it was pointing there within the instance JSS.
Start down here.
I'm radically new at the Amazon thing, but our sysadmins who run our cloud app, have you done anything with using the Amazon ELB to try to do load balancing? Because they've been having problems with it and are switching to Nginx.
Oh, okay.
And I didn't know if you've done anything with that yet. We're not that huge, so I don't know if we would need it, but it's
Right.
an interesting question for those who have lots and lots of nodes.
Right. Yeah, no, I've heard of that, but I've not actually had any production experience with that particular service that they offer. But you said they're switching to Nginx?
I think so, but that might be the wrong thing.
Okay. Okay, that's
I'm trying to
interesting.
follow as best I can. But
Yeah, I'm trying to wonder, like.
drinking from the fire hose on that one.
Right. Okay. Okay. Interesting.
It appears from your slides you've been on the Casper Suite version 8, and so
Yeah.
this kind of refers to version 9, but addressing one of your limitations of not being able to use Casper Remote, I understand the NAP feature, but somebody from Jamf might want to speak up on this. In version 9, you actually get the reported, like the endpoint IP address, so like your internal, and you also get the external IP address.
Okay.
So I don't know if Casper Remote can notice that, and if your console or whatever machine you're on is on the
Right.
VPN or on site, you might be able to
That's the
use
thing,
Casper
yeah.
Remote with that other
That's
IP
actually
address.
a really good point because, yeah, it's like, of course, there are ways of getting the non-public IP from the endpoint, even if your JSS is on EC2. Just that, you know, with version 8, Casper Remote just didn't work, and I'm pretty sure that was because, you know, the public IP was reported back to the JSS, so it didn't know where to find it, basically.
So this might be ignorance on my part, but I saw that when you removed the port within the URL, you had to change the Tomcat user to root user.
Yeah.
Is this? I don't quite understand why root user had to be chosen. It seems like it might be insecure.
Right. Actually, maybe someone from Jamf could answer that question because it's literally the instructions that came directly from Jamf has a write-up on changing the Tomcat port to the default SSL port. You know, I think it depends too. Like if you used the JSS installer, or if you manually configured the JSS using the manual installation package, I think that there is some difference there in how that works, and maybe that has something to do with it. So.
Did you consider any competing services to Amazon?
Yeah, funny story. So I have, and I actually have a little bit of experience running the JSS on Rackspace as well. So in this case, it was simply because the organization was already using AWS for everything, and it was just a natural fit. I mean, you could just end up on the same AWS bill every month. There was no overhead for signing up for a service or anything like that. But yeah, it's definitely a possibility, and I think you know I know of people and organizations that are already doing that on Rackspace.
Was there anything you had to do special to get the distribution point syncing did you just use port forwarding for SMB or?
So just using rsync, basically. So
For the JSS in the cloud to be able to see your Mac Mini under the desk?
the other way around. So the syncing from the, I'm trying to think how it was set up. It's, yeah, pulling from the EC2 instance. The Mac Mini is, it's using rsync. So the, I think it's a launch D that we're using in this case. You can just have it, you know, you just have a very, like literally in a one-liner. It's just one rsync command, and then it just will just sync with the remote distribution point, which in this case the office is already like directly, like there's pretty much like a, think of it as like a direct line to the instance that's running on EC2, like even though it's only accessible from the office and from the VPN. So yeah, there wasn't any challenge in setting that up.
Oh, I was just going to say, when I was playing around with it, I noticed that it defaults you to the Eastern availability zone. And that was, you know, I set it all up in the Eastern zone,
Yep.
and I'm in the Western zone.
Yep,
And that can have a huge impact on your performance. So
yeah,
something to watch out for, that you
Absolutely.
want to make sure you're in the right zone, because it's going to, you know, default you to the East.
yeah,
And that
absolutely.
can be not where you want. So.
I've had that same problem. So yeah, right. Yeah. So he was talking about the, you know, when you're provisioning these instances, just by default, the region that it's going to set up the instance in is Eastern. Obviously, you know, that may not be the right region for you, so keep that in mind. I think you can see that within the AWS Management Console and switch it. Kind of have like a drop down somewhere that you can just change your the zone that you want to spin up the instance in. Definitely a good thing to point out.
This is actually to follow up on the question on why you needed root to run on port 443. Ports below 1024 are privileged ports.
Right.
Standard users can't run on them, and Tomcat is a standard user. So that's why you needed root. Root is privileged enough to be able to run on port 443.
Awesome. Yeah, that makes sense.
I was actually going to say the same thing, but to thank you. To piggyback on that, we actually demote root on all of our boxes, so literally root is nothing, and we create another user class. We actually took this from a Drupal system in Ager, where one user owns everything on the box. So if I need to give operational access to something to non-root, I just change the grouping to another user, so to speak. That's been really helpful. My question actually for you was, are you guys anticipating any issues with the PHP version requirements in version 9? We're a Debian shop, so right now we're running 5.3 and it runs fine against Casper, but moving to version 9, it's got a 5.5 requirement for PHP. I'm pretty sure I can use it with 5.4 and backport it, but it's still something to kind of look at, because I probably won't get 5.5 support for another year for a Jessie release for Debian. We run Ubuntu as our stack solution, but we run Debian as our VMs. I was curious if you ran into any, or if you're anticipating any issue with Amazon Cloud Services for PHP version support.
It probably wouldn't affect me in particular, but yeah, I think that, you know, that is something like, I guess like in your case, you're obviously not referring to running the JSS, right? You're just talking about in general, like, you know, is this a good platform to use, right? Okay. Yeah. Do you not get the ability to use whatever version of PHP you want?
It's a little different. So we're just starting to puppet our configs for Debian, and right now we run a web shop, so we run little Debian boxes, tons and tons of little Debian boxes. So it's easier for us. Like you said, it was a natural fit for Amazon because you already had the infrastructure. I can spin up a Debian box in 45 seconds and do a custom build of Apache and do the ownership stuff for the root and all those
Right.
nice pretty things that make life easier with the little GUI and stuff for our webmin. So
Right.
we literally use webmin instances for our servers. And if anyone doesn't know, webmin is a version of Debian that already has all the web tools built for you, and it's really secure, it's nice, and they do all these things for you, and it's pretty well documented. The reason we do that is because, well, we admit we're stupid and we don't know security all that well. So we do that because it's a way for us to get about 2 years out of a box. Whereas Ubuntu, I love it to death, but I get like maybe 3 months before I have to go start tinkering with it again, even in the LTS releases. So that's kind of why we go that direction.
Right.
But I mean, we still run them, right now we're still running a Mac Mini with AFP because AFP freaking rocks. And we're looking at switching over to HTTPS and SMB for Samba too.
Right.
But for our concern, it's like, well, we already built all this stuff and we're kind of worried that the PHP versioning could be an issue with some of the web access stuff. And I was just curious because we're also looking at Rackspace and Amazon Web Services, and we want to be able to make sure that some of our configs can go over in those environments. So that's kind of why I was asking if you guys
Right.
were looking, is that a point of concern, or if you're even thinking about blending the lines between your web servers and, you know, not necessarily your JSS, but, you know, your JDS servers or your web services hosting.
Right.
Sorry,
Okay.
that's a lot in one sentence.
Oh, no, that's great. I think two things. So if you're using Puppet to deploy your servers, or you plan to, you could just have an exception or like something in your manifest that, you know, ensures that PHP version whatever .x is running and is available. And then also, you do have the option of, like, if you have an existing, like, and you're in a situation like you have like a platform that you're familiar with, you know, you have like something that's very specific and it's not available on EC2, it's custom, you have the option of basically uploading that to Amazon's cloud and then using that for your EC2 instances. So that's an option as well.
Hey, I was just curious if you've had any experience or exposure to the new JSS in the cloud offering from Jamf, and how that might compare to rolling your own, basically what you've done here.
Right.
Maybe on a price perspective, or
Yeah. I haven't looked into that yet, but yeah, of course that caught my attention as soon as that was announced. You know, I think it depends on, you know, like what type of environment you are. Like if you're like I was talking about, like if you're already using Amazon Web Services for everything and you have infrastructure in place for this already, it might be easier for you to just spin up an instance yourself and do it all yourself. But yeah, absolutely, like the, you know, Jamf hosting that for you could also be a great solution depending on the organization. So.
to be frank, I was a bit disappointed that there haven't been more sessions on the JSS in the cloud that Jamf
Yeah,
is offering. It's like, why aren't they touting this thing? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
It seems like
yeah, I
it's
would like
pretty
to.
great.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any more questions? Any hands I'm missing?
Cool. If that's all we have, we'll go ahead and wrap up this session. Thank you guys for coming. Thank you for the questions. Thanks, James.
Thanks a lot.